Imagine you're a child, full of curiosity and wonder, unaware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. You think you're playing a harmless game, imitating something you saw on TV. But what happens when that game becomes something far more sinister? Tonight, I'll share with you a chilling experience, told in the first person, that will make you rethink the boundaries between playfulness and the unknown. This is not just any story. It's a real-life account of an encounter with the inexplicable, where fear and reality blur together in the most terrifying way possible. Stay with me as we unravel a night that started with innocent fun and quickly spiraled into sheer horror. Before we dive into this unsettling tale, if you're a fan of real-life paranormal stories that send chills down your spine, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on the next terrifying chapter. And if you're brave enough, share this video with friends who also enjoy tales of the supernatural, or those who claim they don't believe in it. After hearing this, they just might change their minds. Now, picture this. A quiet night in a small, secluded town. Two children, about 10 years old, decide to recreate a scene from a horror movie they watched earlier that evening. A movie that played with dark rituals and dangerous incantations. But what starts as a silly imitation quickly turns into something much darker. What they awaken that night is not just a game, it's a nightmare. They unknowingly invite something into their lives, something far older and much more malevolent than they could have ever imagined. Are you ready to hear what happened next? I warn you, this story will make you question everything you think you know about the safety of childhood games. The following events are not for the faint of heart. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for the terror that unfolds in the Night of the Demons. This opening pulls the viewer into the narrative immediately, setting a tone of mystery and fear. By teasing the story as real and unsettling, it creates an emotional hook that makes the audience eager to know what happens next, heightening the tension with each sentence. It was a quiet, suffocatingly still night in a rural town far from the noise of the city. The air was thick, almost heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The house, an old duplex with creaky wooden floors and dim lighting, sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road. Surrounded by tall, twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands, the house felt isolated, cut off from the world. This place, with its peeling wallpaper and cracked windows, had always been strange. But tonight, it would become something far worse, a place where the boundaries between reality and the supernatural would blur. The first floor of the house, where the story unfolds, was a room shrouded in shadow, lit only by the flicker of an old lamp in the corner. The walls seemed to close in as the children, eager to replicate the ritual they had seen in Night of the Demons 2, gathered their makeshift supplies. The floor beneath them groaned under their weight as they sketched out a crude pentagram on the worn wooden boards. The room smelled faintly of dust and decay, the kind of scent that clings to old, forgotten places. A chill began to settle in, not just from the cold night air, but something more, something they couldn't explain. Outside, the wind howled softly, but it did little to disturb the unnatural stillness within the house. The world outside felt miles away, as if nothing could reach them in this secluded place. No one would hear their screams. No one would come to help if something went wrong. It was just the two of them, alone in a room that seemed to be watching them, waiting. The flickering light cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind outside felt amplified, as if the house itself was alive, breathing alongside them. As they lit the candles and placed them carefully at each point of the pentagram, the dim glow seemed to fight against the darkness, but it never fully pushed it away. It lingered, heavy and oppressive, like an unwelcome guest. The children laughed nervously, their voices barely above a whisper, but the laughter felt forced, as if they were trying to convince themselves that this was all just a game. But deep down, they both knew something was wrong. The air in the room seemed to thrum with an energy they couldn't understand, an invisible force pressing down on them. As they began to recite the words of the chant, their voices echoed unnaturally in the room, bouncing off the walls in ways that didn't make sense. "Mi hallo ben cheta," they repeated over and over, the words sounding foreign and wrong, like a spell that should never have been spoken. With each repetition, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Their breath came out in small clouds, visible in the cold air, and the candles flickered wildly, as if fighting against an unseen wind. The room felt smaller, tighter, and for the first time that night, true fear began to creep into their hearts. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deafening crash, as if something heavy had fallen upstairs, shaking the walls of the house. The sound reverberated through the floor, making their hearts race and their bodies freeze. They stopped chanting, their voices caught in their throats. What had they just unleashed? The house felt alive now, pulsing with something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows, just out of sight. And now, it was awake. This section builds a rich, eerie atmosphere, emphasizing isolation and the oppressive tension that surrounds the characters. The slow, creeping fear grows with each detail, making the audience feel the dread and suspense as if they were in the room themselves. The setting becomes a character of its own, filled with mystery and anticipation, heightening the terror of what's to come. It started with something small, barely noticeable at first, but enough to send a shiver down their spines. A faint creaking sound, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on the floorboards above them. The noise was subtle, almost like footsteps, slow and deliberate. But they were the only ones in the house on the second floor. At first, they tried to ignore it, convincing themselves it was just the old house settling, as old houses tend to do. But deep down, they both knew better. This wasn't just the building shifting under the weight of time. It felt purposeful, like something was pacing just beyond their line of sight, watching, waiting. As the seconds ticked by, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Their breath now came in visible, trembling puffs, hanging in the cold air like tiny clouds of fear. The candles flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls, making the room feel alive with movement. The flames seemed to bend toward the pentagram on the floor, as if drawn by some invisible force, trembling under the weight of something unseen but undeniably present. It was then that the cousins exchanged a look, an unspoken realization passing between them. They had awoken something, and it was no longer just a game. Then came the sound, a loud, unmistakable crash from the floor above, as if something heavy had been thrown to the ground. The noise reverberated through the walls, shaking the very foundations of the house. Their laughter died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the rapid thudding of their hearts. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to flee from whatever had just been disturbed. But fear held them rooted to the spot, frozen in place, as though the house itself was trapping them within its dark embrace. Their eyes darted toward the ceiling, but nothing followed the crash. No footsteps, no further disturbances. Just the echo of the impact still ringing in their ears. The room felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had become thick and oppressive, weighing them down with an overwhelming sense of dread. They whispered to each other, their voices shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers, only more questions. What could have made that noise? Why did the house seem so alive with tension? Then it happened again, this time closer. A sound like marbles, small and deliberate, bouncing and rolling across the floor above them. The rhythmic tapping of each marble hitting the floor echoed through the house, and with every bounce, the tension in the room grew unbearable. They could almost picture it, a set of marbles scattering across the wooden boards, bouncing, rolling, but they hadn't brought any marbles. There was nothing upstairs that could make such a sound. It was impossible, yet there it was, clear and unmistakable. They stood frozen, unable to move, their breaths shallow and quick. The marbles continued to bounce and roll, and with each passing second, the noise grew louder, as if whatever was playing with them was getting closer, descending from above. They couldn't see it, but they could feel it. Something watching them from the shadows, just out of reach. The air around them seemed to thrum with a dark energy, a presence they couldn't explain but could no longer deny. It was as if the house had become a conduit for something beyond the physical world, something they had unintentionally invited into their space. In their minds, they tried to rationalize it, to explain away the sounds and the sudden cold. Maybe the old house was playing tricks on them. Maybe their imaginations were running wild after watching the horror movie. But the longer they stood there, paralyzed by fear, the more they realized that this was no trick. This was real. The house had come alive around them, and whatever they had disturbed was making itself known in terrifying ways. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of the horror that awaited them, and the worst was yet to come. This section deepens the sense of unease by gradually introducing the supernatural elements. The subtle progression from minor disturbances to clear, inexplicable phenomena creates an atmosphere of dread that builds with every moment. The focus on the sounds, footsteps, crashing marbles, makes the terror feel immediate and intimate, as if the unknown is creeping closer with each passing second. The mystery surrounding what's truly happening keeps the viewer on edge, anticipating the inevitable confrontation with the unknown. The air in the room felt thick with tension, like it was pressing in on them from all sides, suffocating them under an invisible weight. The marbles had stopped rolling, but the silence that followed was even worse. It wasn't the comforting quiet of an empty house. It was the heavy, ominous kind of silence that made their hearts pound louder in their ears, their breaths short and shallow. The two cousins stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. Every instinct told them to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something held them there, something stronger than fear, curiosity. Or maybe it was something more sinister, a force they couldn't see, urging them to stay and face whatever they had summoned. They exchanged nervous glances, each hoping the other would suggest they leave. But neither of them moved. The fear was palpable, but there was something else too, an unspoken challenge, the thrill of the unknown. What if this was all just in their heads? What if it really was just the old house playing tricks on them? They had seen the ritual in a movie, after all. None of it was supposed to be real. They had to find out. The urge to understand what was happening, to uncover the truth, gnawed at them despite the creeping terror. It was the kind of curiosity that children often have, the dangerous kind that pushes them toward the unknown, even when every fiber of their being screams at them to turn back. "We should check upstairs," one of them whispered, though his voice trembled with doubt. The other nodded hesitantly, though her hands were shaking. The decision had been made. They couldn't leave without knowing. As they slowly began to move toward the staircase, their feet dragging against the floor, the air seemed to grow even colder, as if the house itself was warning them not to proceed. But they ignored the warning, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. Step by step, they ascended the stairs, the wooden boards creaking beneath their weight, the sound echoing through the empty house like a countdown to something terrible. Every step felt heavier than the last, the shadows at the top of the staircase seeming to grow darker, deeper, as if something was lurking just beyond the threshold. They paused halfway up, their courage wavering. The memory of the crash, the rolling marbles, the oppressive silence, it all flooded back, stronger than ever. It would be so easy to turn around, to run back down the stairs, and pretend none of this had ever happened. They could go back to the safety of the family downstairs, return to the normalcy of their lives. But deep down, they knew there was no going back now. They had started something, and they couldn't stop it without facing whatever waited for them in the darkness. The internal conflict was almost unbearable, the tug of war between self-preservation and the need for answers. Their hearts raced, each beat louder than the last. Should they really go up there? What if they found something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't escape? What if whatever was making those noises was still up there, waiting for them? The questions buzzed in their minds, growing louder with each passing second, but the desire to uncover the truth pushed them forward, despite the fear gnawing at their insides. They had to know. Finally, they reached the top of the stairs. The door to the room was slightly ajar, just as they had left it, but the shadows beyond it seemed thicker, almost alive. They stood at the threshold, their hands trembling, their bodies tense with anticipation. Whatever was waiting for them on the other side could be anything. Maybe it was just a trick of the old house, a harmless coincidence. Or maybe it was something far darker, something they had accidentally called upon. They had a choice: turn back and live with the unanswered questions, or push forward and face the unknown. With one last glance at each other, they stepped into the room, and the moment they crossed the threshold, they knew they had made the wrong choice. This section amplifies the tension by exploring the characters' internal conflict, whether to flee or face the unknown. The fear is palpable, but it's offset by their curiosity, creating a powerful emotional pull that draws them deeper into the situation. The slow, deliberate build-up to their decision makes the audience feel every moment of dread, keeping them on edge as the protagonists approach what may be their undoing. The lingering sense of danger heightens the mystery, making the viewer question what awaits beyond the shadows. The moment they stepped into the room, a bone-chilling cold washed over them, far more intense than before. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into their very bones, freezing them in place. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if it were alive, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. The faint glow of the candles barely pierced through the oppressive darkness, casting long, twisted shadows that danced eerily on the walls. The room, which had seemed empty just moments ago, now felt crowded, filled with an unseen presence, something watching them from the very corners of the shadows, waiting for them to notice it. And then they did. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in their peripheral vision, something shifting in the far corner of the room where the shadows seemed the thickest. They both turned toward it at the same time, their hearts racing, eyes wide with terror. The shadows seemed to coalesce, taking shape, growing darker and more defined. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, stretching and bending, forming into something more, a figure that wasn't supposed to be there. It stood still, just barely visible, but undeniably present. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to scrape against the ceiling, its form blending into the darkness, making it hard to see where it ended and the shadows began. The cousins stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their minds racing to comprehend what they were seeing. Was this a trick of a light? Their imaginations playing tricks on them? But the longer they stared, the more they realized that this was no illusion. It was real. Horribly, terrifyingly real. The figure didn't move, but they could feel its gaze on them, cold and unfeeling, like it was studying them, deciding what to do next. The air around them grew impossibly still, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. Without warning, the candles flickered violently, their flames snuffed out in an instant, plunging the room into complete darkness. The only sound was their own ragged breathing, but even that seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick silence that followed. They couldn't see anything now, not even their own hands in front of them. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, but they could feel it. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, lurking just beyond their reach, watching them. The sense of dread was overwhelming, a visceral, primal fear that told them they were no longer safe. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room, slow and deliberate, each step growing closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy, something unnatural. The cousins clung to each other, their hearts pounding in their chests, terror coursing through their veins. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a brief moment, there was only silence. But that silence was worse than the sound. It was the kind of silence that screamed of something terrible, something waiting in the dark. And then a whisper, soft, barely audible, but undeniably there. It came from a corner where the figure had been, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. They couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. It was calling to them, beckoning them closer. They didn't move, too terrified to even breathe. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire room, pressing in on them from all sides. Suddenly, a hand, cold, impossibly cold, brushed against one of them, just for a second, but long enough to send them both into a panic. They screamed, stumbling backward, their bodies colliding with the doorframe as they tried to escape. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside with whatever was lurking in the dark. The figure, now barely visible in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked window, seemed to be moving closer, its shape twisting and contorting unnaturally as it advanced toward them. It was then that they realized they weren't going to make it out of this room, not without facing whatever they had summoned. This scene intensifies the terror, focusing on the character's direct confrontation with the supernatural entity. The gradual buildup, from flickers of movement in the shadows to the full manifestation of the figure, creates a crescendo of fear. The oppressive atmosphere, the suffocating darkness, and the physical touch of the entity all heighten the dread. The character's terror is palpable, and the supernatural confrontation becomes inescapable, drawing the viewer deeper into the story's horror. The figure moved closer, its form a twisted amalgamation of darkness and something far worse, something that seemed to defy the very nature of reality. Its limbs were impossibly long, contorting in ways that no living thing should be able to. With each step, the room grew colder, the air thick with a suffocating pressure that seemed to crush the breath from their lungs. The cousins could feel it closing in, but their feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. Their bodies trembled, but they couldn't look away. It was as if the darkness had wrapped itself around them, paralyzing them with fear, holding them captive. And then the figure stopped. It loomed over them, its face, or what could be called a face, obscured in shadow, a black void where eyes should have been. But they could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, drilling into their very souls. It was as though this thing, whatever it was, could see straight through them, into their deepest fears, their darkest secrets. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as they waited for whatever horror was about to unfold. But then something strange happened, something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The figure began to shift, its form rippling and distorting, as though reality itself was being bent and twisted around it. In the dim light, they could see its shape changing, morphing into something familiar. It was no longer just a formless shadow. It was becoming them. The cousins stared in horror as the figure took on their likeness, mimicking their appearances, their expressions, even their terrified breathing. It was as though they were staring into a mirror, an impossibly dark and twisted reflection of themselves. But the terror didn't end there. As the figures solidified into their mirrored forms, it began to speak. At first, it was nothing more than a garbled whisper, the same voice they had heard before, low and guttural. But slowly, the words became clearer, more distinct, and what it said chilled them to the core. It wasn't just repeating their own words back to them. It was speaking their thoughts, their fears, the doubts that had plagued them since they first entered the room. It knew everything about them, every dark thought they had tried to bury, every fear they had never spoken aloud. And now, it was using that knowledge against them. "You brought me here," the figure hissed, its voice a perfect imitation of theirs, but twisted wrong. "You called me, and now you'll never leave." The weight of those words settled over them like a death sentence. This wasn't just some haunting. They had summoned something far worse than they could have ever imagined, something that could reach into their minds, pull out their deepest fears, and turn them into a living nightmare. The realization hit them like a cold wave. This thing wasn't just here to scare them. It was here to consume them, to become them. The ritual they had performed wasn't a game. It was an invitation, and they had opened a door that could never be closed. Desperation clawed at their chests as they tried to move, to flee from the room, but the door remained shut, as though the house itself had trapped them. The figure stepped closer, its movements a grotesque mimicry of their own, and they could feel the walls closing in around them. The air was so thick now, so heavy, that it felt like they were drowning in it, suffocating under the weight of their own terror. They could hear their own thoughts screaming inside their heads, but no sound escaped their lips. They were powerless, trapped in a nightmare they had unwittingly created. And then, in the darkness, the final revelation came. As the figure loomed over them, its face twisted into a cruel imitation of their own, they understood the true horror of the situation. This thing, this entity, wasn't just here to haunt them. It wanted to take their place. It wanted to wear their faces, live their lives, and erase them from existence. It had no form of its own. It was a parasite, feeding on fear, drawing power from the terror it invoked. And now, it had found the perfect vessels. The final, horrifying realization washed over them. They had become the ritual. They were the sacrifice. The entity wasn't just an intruder in their lives. It was going to become them. Every moment they had spent in this room, every whisper they had heard, every shadow they had seen, had been leading to this. They had summoned it, and now it would erase them completely, leaving nothing behind but hollow shells of who they once were. The figure's cold, dead hands reached out, its touch like ice against their skin. And in that moment, they knew there was no escape. No one would ever know what happened to them. The house would remain silent, unchanged, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to stumble upon its secrets. The entity had what it wanted, and as their vision blurred, they felt themselves slipping away, their identities dissolving into the darkness. The last thing they heard before everything went black was their own voice, twisted and distorted, whispering in the dark, "You can never leave." This climax takes the story to its peak, revealing the true nature of the supernatural entity. The terror escalates as the protagonists come face to face with the horrifying realization that they are not only haunted, but are being replaced. The slow, creeping fear turns into full-blown panic as they realize they are powerless against the entity, creating an intense, unforgettable moment of terror and mystery. The idea of losing not just their lives, but their very identities adds a layer of psychological horror, leaving the audience gripped until the very last word. The house stood eerily silent as the darkness slowly lifted. The figure was gone, leaving only a haunting emptiness in its wake. The cousins, once full of life and curiosity, now sat motionless in the center of the room. Their eyes were wide open, but there was something deeply wrong about them, vacant, as if the light behind them had been snuffed out. They were still breathing, still alive in the physical sense, but the essence of who they had been was lost. Whatever had happened inside that room had stolen more than their courage. It had taken something far more precious, something they would never get back. They stumbled down the stairs hours later, their movements slow and mechanical, as though they were puppets being dragged by invisible strings. The family, unaware of the terror that had unfolded upstairs, greeted them with casual smiles, asking if they'd had fun playing. But the cousins didn't respond. They couldn't. They moved like shadows of their former selves, hollowed out by the unspeakable horror they had experienced. The house seemed quieter now, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that followed something terrible, the kind that suggested the worst was far from over. As the days passed, it became clear that the cousins were no longer the same. They didn't speak about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone. The memories of the encounter were buried deep, locked away where they could never be reached, but the effects lingered like a dark cloud over their lives. The house, once a place of childhood innocence and laughter, had become a prison, a reminder of what they had seen and what they had lost. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a candle brought them back to that night, to the moment when they realized they had crossed into something far beyond their understanding. But the most disturbing part was how the house had changed. It was subtle at first. Doors that were always slightly ajar, the faint smell of smoke in the air despite no candles being lit, and the strange sensation that someone was always watching. The once familiar home now felt foreign, like a place that no longer belonged to them. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, and every corner held the potential for something to emerge. But the true horror lay not in the house itself, but in the growing realization that the entity wasn't gone. It had left something behind. The cousins began to notice strange things about each other, little differences, almost imperceptible at first. A pause before answering a question. A tilt of the head that felt off. But the worst was the feeling of being observed, even when they were alone. It was as if the entity hadn't completely left. It had taken a piece of them, a part of their souls, and was now residing in the space between their thoughts, whispering in the dark. There were nights when they would wake up, drenched in sweat, convinced they had heard footsteps in the hall. Other nights, it was the soft rolling of marbles, bouncing across the floor, echoing from upstairs. But no matter how hard they searched, they could never find anything out of place. The family began to notice too. At first, it was the distant look in their eyes, the way they seemed to drift off mid-conversation, lost in thoughts they couldn't or wouldn't share. Then came the nightmares. Both cousins began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about something in the room, something standing over their beds, watching them. But when the lights were turned on, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being hunted never left. It was as if the entity was still with them, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, waiting for the right moment to strike again. One day, they decided to return to the room where it all began, hoping to find some closure, some way to end the nightmare. But when they reached the door, it was locked. No matter how hard they pushed, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had sealed off the room, trapping the terror inside, ensuring that they would never open that door again. And so they left it, leaving the horror behind, but only in that physical space. Because no matter how far they tried to run, no matter how much they tried to forget, the darkness followed them. It was a part of them now, woven into the very fabric of their being. Years passed, and the cousins grew older, but they were never truly free. They lived with the constant knowledge that something had been taken from them that night, something they would never get back. They no longer feared the dark because they knew what it held. They had seen it, lived it, and it had left its mark. But the true horror wasn't what they had seen that night. It was the realization that the entity had never truly left. It had simply found new hosts. And as they went on with their lives, pretending that everything was normal, they could still hear the faint sound of marbles rolling in the distance, a reminder that some things, once invited, can never be banished. The story ends with them walking away from the house, but as they leave, the camera lingers on the upstairs window. For just a moment, in the reflection of the glass, there's a flash of movement, a shadow, indistinct and formless, watching. And then, just as quickly, it's gone, leaving only the chilling sense that the story isn't truly over. And perhaps it never will be. As the years passed, the cousins tried to bury the memories of that night, but some experiences leave scars too deep to heal. Even as adults, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been taken from them in that house. Something intangible, yet vital. They carried it with them, like a shadow that never quite left their side. The world around them returned to normal, but they never did. There was always an unsettling sense of wrongness that clung to them, like they were never truly alone, no matter how much distance they put between themselves and that old house. It wasn't just the house that haunted them. It was the pervasive feeling that they had been marked, claimed by something beyond their understanding. In the quiet moments, when the world went still, they would catch glimpses of it, just at the edge of their vision. A flicker in a reflection, a shadow where there should be none, the faintest sound of marbles rolling across an empty floor. At first, they tried to tell themselves it was all in their heads, that their minds were simply playing tricks on them. But as time went on, they realized that the entity they had summoned hadn't been left behind in that house. It had followed them, lurking in the darkest corners of their lives. The cousins rarely spoke of that night. How could they? How could they explain the weight of a fear that never truly left, the sense of always being watched by something just beyond the light? Whenever they met, there was a silent understanding between them, a shared horror that words couldn't capture. The nightmares never fully went away either. Some nights, they would wake up drenched in sweat, hearts pounding, convinced they had heard again, the sound of marbles bouncing, echoing through the silence. But there were no marbles, and the rooms were always empty. And yet, the fear remained. One day, one of them decided to return to the house, seeking answers. Maybe it was a need for closure, or maybe it was something darker, a compulsion they couldn't resist, as if the entity was calling them back. The house had been abandoned for years now, left to decay like the memories they had tried to suppress. But as they stood in front of it once again, that old feeling crept back in, the cold, the suffocating weight of something unseen. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked, but it didn't matter. They didn't need to go inside to know the truth. The house was still alive, still waiting, and whatever they had disturbed at night was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching. The cousin who returned never spoke of the visit, not to anyone. But after that, something about them changed. They became quieter, more withdrawn, as if they were carrying an even darker secret. And then, one night, they simply disappeared. No one saw them leave. No trace was found. The only thing left behind was a single marble, placed carefully on the windowsill of their room. The other cousin knew, without needing to ask, that the entity had finally claimed what it had been waiting for. The house hadn't let them go. It had just taken its time. In the years that followed, the remaining cousin tried to live a normal life, but normal was a word that had lost all meaning. They moved far away, started fresh, but the past has a way of creeping back in, no matter how far you run. Late at night, in the silence of their new home, they could still hear it. The faint rolling of marbles across the floor, like a distant memory, or perhaps a warning. The entity had taken one of them, but it wasn't done. It never would be. The final, unshakable truth was that once you invite something into your life, it never truly leaves. Now, the remaining cousin lives in a state of quiet paranoia, constantly looking over their shoulder, expecting the shadows to come alive once more. They rarely sleep, for fear of what they might see in their dreams. And in those rare moments of sleep, they dream of that old house. The stairs, the locked door, the sound of marbles bouncing, echoing through the hallways. They wake up with the taste of fear in their mouths, the cold sweat of realization that they're still trapped, still hunted. And so the story ends not with a scream, but with a whisper, an unsettling sense that the entity is still out there, still watching, waiting for its moment to return. It may be silent for now, but silence is its strongest weapon. The remaining cousin knows this all too well, and though they try to move on, try to forget, they know in their heart that it's only a matter of time before the darkness comes back for them. The final shot shows the cousin sitting alone in their new home, staring blankly out the window. The camera lingers for a moment, panning slowly to the corner of the room, where a single marble sits on the floor, perfectly still. The scene fades to black, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that some stories don't end. They just pause, waiting for the next chapter to unfold.